Well, hello once again, and we are returning to what I'm very pleased to say is our next panel, which is on Sudan. Um, and so, we have a very brief break, but we are now up for our second rich panel. So I'm so very pleased to introduce our next panel, composed of three dynamic Sudanese individuals whose work illumines the realities of forced migration and its diplomatic implications, not only for Sudan, but the region of Northeast Africa and beyond. As the war in Sudan most tragically continues to unfold, the issue of forced migration is front and center in the minds of those who are seeking an end to this conflict. Our panelists are uniquely qualified to address these realities, as this roundtable includes a former government minister, the leader of an NGO, and a scholar, all of whose work directly intersects with the realities of modern Sudan and the role forced migration is playing in the midst of war. Each of our members, um, each of our speakers will talk for 13 to 15 minutes, followed by a time for audience members to pose questions. We welcome your questions and ask that you post them via the Q&A portal that you will find at the bottom of your screen. And I will pose them to our panelists once all three speakers have spoken. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Lena Magou, the former Sudanese Minister of Labor and Social Development, a post which she held following the revolution in 2019 until February of 2021. Lena is a co-founder of Impact Hub Khartoum, in which she has been involved since 2015, which is part of a global network focused on social entrepreneurship and social impact. In addition, she is a board member of the Caucus for Women in Politics in the Arab region. Lena was the Sudan advisor for the UN Global Compact Office in New York and launched the Sudan Network in 2008. She was the recipient of the CSR Arabia Award in 2010 and 2013, and the UN PSI Award for Social Investment in 2013. Lena holds an MA in Development Studies from the University of Manchester and a BSc in Business Administration from Afad University for Women. She's also been a lecturer for Afad University for Women, as well as a senior program officer for CARE International, as well as an external affairs manager for the Shell Company of the Sudan Limited. Lena has been a national coordinator for Ubuntu Lab Africa since 2017, and is also a member of the Global Transformation Thinkers Network, which focuses on democracy and good governance. Lena is passionate about advancing social justice and human rights, and most wonderfully describes herself as a forever optimist. Lena joins us today from Riyadh. Welcome, Lena.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure being here today, and I thank you a lot for the invitation to be part of this panel. And so regards to you, the university, and all the audience, my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure being here. Just one correction. I wasn't the recipient of all these awards. I was part of a team that, helped support my company at the time received these awards. Just wanted to say that at the beginning. Again, thanks, David. To be honest, I was really excited when I got the invitation, especially about the topic of this conference, and being Sudanese and what we're going through right now, perhaps is definitely part of that. I would like to start differently in a way. 25 years ago, to be honest, exactly 25 years ago, I wrote a preface for my theses around the experience of refugee women in North England, or in the Northern England part, and I took like 5 life history approaches, and I just want to share that because and start and make it my point of departure. And thank you a lot for the questions posed, and I think it's a provocation for what I'd like to speak about in these few minutes. Okay, just a sec. So, rebuilding lives and making dreams come true. Yearning for a better tomorrow is all they do. With sadness and fear and tear-filled eyes, they manage to talk about yesterday, the past that was and is no more. Yet still, with a special love and tenderness, they speak about that place they call home and all that they left back home. They back and forth tell me their story, sharing their strife, their joy, and or their life. They cry for yesterday, and I cry too. They pray for the coming days, and I too. For they and I share that special place, share what they and I call home. For we all dream of a better day, a day where peace for all is reality, where life is not a constant test, where life is full of joy and happiness, where our Sudan is a better place, where we could live a life that can be the best there is. Throughout these pages, I have relived so many lives, and I have lived through many pains, and dare dream of a better place for all and every fellow human being who has been forced to leave a life and begin the search for one new, till one regains the old one back or chooses to keep the new. So a very young me at the time, and I would not have imagined that, 25 years later, I'll be in that same position, and I'll know firsthand what I experienced just through listening to other people's stories and through just my following different issues and we're in a really sad time, if I may, or a very complex time that we are in right now. It's a mad world, and especially when we speak about topics such as forced migration. And and I must say, I was very happy to hear about, this new diplomacy, and everyday diplomacy, and reading more about it and just understanding. And I think this is exactly what we need now, a different type of diplomacy that has definitely been experienced in so many different ways. And I think this is part of just discussing how we feel that this is the way forward. Um, I loved reading also one of the quotes that grabbed my attention and reminded me of this preface, actually, was one by James Dorian, I think, in some of the in the readings, and he speaks about estrangement, which I found very interesting. He asserts that it is not interstate culture and interdependence, but rather difference, deviance, and otherness, which constitute and reveal the need for diplomatic culture. And it made me think that we're at a time where we should be rethinking all these differences and with the rise, as you started this conference earlier, I think that we're dealing with a lot of phobias, xenophobia and this extreme right and the otherness, and it's all about the other. So how can we deconstruct or unpack the all this, you know that is being, let's say, experienced, when we feel that, why is forced migration becoming such a big issue, right? And why is it that we're feeling a huge crisis when it comes to international humanitarian law, when we talk about refugee law, and nobody's actually following that or respecting that. And I take the example of Sudan now. I think it's it's the largest displacement, more than 12 million, 10 million inside Sudan, and 2 million, I think more. Probably statistics are much more than that. When we talk about forced migration because of a lot of different issues. Whether it's war, or now what we're seeing with climate change as well. And I think it's about time that we think, how can we use this different kind of diplomacy and transprofessional diplomacy, in addressing the issues that we have now, and how can we use preventative diplomacy as well in thinking about that. And I think that's the role where we look at how can we, as citizen diplomats, how can even state actors or non-state actors, the first question about their role in supporting dealing with such different issues, because how can we think of people as, how can we just focus on it being the human being, the human kind of experience of it, and focus on that. And how can we bring that home to all the different people, and that, And it's not about the other. It's just an experience that we might also go through because of the different things that are happening, whether it's climate change or whether it's war, and it's such a, the dynamics of the world, right? It's things that are happening now. We don't know what's happening now in the Middle East, or how that overnight we wouldn't have imagined that we can wake up and to the worst nightmare ever, that me as a Sudanese, and the millions of Sudanese like me who just woke up and find themselves that they needed to leave. And that was an experience that I went through firsthand. When the war broke out in April, 15th of April 2023. And then you were faced with different issues, issues around, visas, and how can I, and so many different people like me, who are running for their lives, are asked for visas. They're waiting at borders. What's the experience of people at a human level, at a personal level? And it's just not statistics. And I think that for me is one of the main questions, is how can we share that, how can we make it personal? How can we make it, something that we relate to? And I think that's the role of non-state actors, of civil society, of thinking about, this is not how can we move away from the fear that this is creating, and saying that, look, it's nothing to be afraid of. It's nothing to be scared of. It's that estrangement, is something that we can work around, and help overcome and help address. And I see that, whether it's, different civil society organizations, or even when we're talking about state, or talking about economies, or talking about, and the fear of, the refugee, and who is a refugee, and who is, an internally displaced person, or, and I think it's all about raising awareness. So at the heart of it is just understanding that we need to look at things differently, and it's about time to say that things haven't been working the way that they have, over the years. Definitely something wrong. So maybe we need to do things differently. And this is what I love about professional diplomacy. It's about doing things differently and looking at things with a different lens. Another thing that I think is also important is that maybe it's also about time that we need to revisit institutions. One of the questions is about institutions, and who are the institutions that protect. And I think it's and I also agree to a large extent, is that we're moving away from protection, using states are flexing their muscles, or just finding new ways to kind of block or protect themselves. And I think this is this is a major flaw in the system. And to what extent can UN agencies support when when we're looking at so many different crises at different parts of the world, but there's nothing beyond statements of and expressions of concern. So I think it is definitely about time that we look at different ways of using, everyday diplomacy to address these issues, to say, this is, how can we do this differently? And how can we use businesses to think about things differently? And how can we use, the media? And the media played a huge role. And I think it's an excellent and powerful tool that we need to use more of in public diplomacy. And maybe my fellow panelists will agree that one of our issues was around, where we're looking at Sudan, and we're not in the media. We feel that we're forgotten. There are so many double standards that we feel that the injustices, basically, of having to ask for visas when, for example, if we talk about the example of Ukraine war, where people opened the borders, and their countries, and they welcomed Ukrainians, whereas for Sudanese you have to pay different kinds of amounts for visas, whereas you're just you're left with nothing. And it feels that most of the Sudanese feel that they've been let down, that the system failed them, that the whole world failed them. And and this is not fair. And I think this is the role of diplomacy here, especially for a country that has been hosting millions and millions of refugees for over 50 years. We've had, open borders in a large way. We've been hosting our, neighbors from neighboring countries, and also from the Arab region, for so many years. And so for us, the experience was really strange, that you just overnight you feel that you're left alone, and and that nobody's listening and nobody cares. And so how can we use the different ways of looking at amplifying voices, and is it something selective? Do you hear about certain crises in different parts of the world but not others? And I think that is also the role of civil society, of the citizen diplomats. And some of the experiences I went through was, just meeting. I mean, I've been in different countries since the war erupted, and just meeting people who say, and it makes you feel so different when you hear from other nationalities that that they know, that they listen, that they're worried, that they share concern, that they're hoping for a better outcome, and for Sudan and for Sudanese. And for me, that is also diplomacy, and it was so interesting just reading about that, and thinking, yes, everyday diplomacy, and you're an everyday diplomat when you're advocating and campaigning, for we're looking at worst hunger crisis in Sudan right now, and talking about that. So you're campaigning, whether at an individual level or part of an organization, or part of a network. And I think this is the time where we need collaboration, and we need collaboration across borders, and beyond. It's not just something that's especially if we're looking at mobility and forced migration, something that's now just you know across borders, and looking at in different regions that are on the move, really. And when we look at climate change, so how can we be innovative and creative and thinking about ways of addressing that, or whether it's prevention or just looking at how can we host um, um, uh, people who had to flee their homes for different reasons. And for many people, they'd love to go back, but the choice of going back is not easy. But I think it's also important to look at what are the ways that we can use diplomacy to build bridges, and to actually to address different concerns. How can we look at supporting the different institutions? If I said earlier that we need to kind of revisit the whole system, is to what extent can we look at these institutions that support, like for example the UNHCR, who can't actually do much if the country doesn't agree to certain policies, or the country itself has certain policies. So there's nothing much that can be done, and there's so many different examples for that. And I think it's important that we now look at how can we collaborate across borders, cross boundaries, to look at different solutions. I mean, one of the things that I did with Impact Hub was look at refugee entrepreneurship. And it was interesting how refugee entrepreneurship is a huge source of income, and an interesting way of looking at things when we're looking at the experience of refugees. And there's an excellent example of a Kakuma village in Nairobi, in Kenya, and how they've transformed this, which was initially an IDP camp that has become this huge, big market. So there are different examples that can be used, when we're looking at economy, when we're looking at, the how can host communities benefit, and I think at the heart of it is this human connection, and how can we make that human connection, and bring people together, and be a mediator, and that is the role of diplomacy. So raising awareness, about different plights. How can we move, how can we let people move away from that feeling of estrangement that James Didarian mentioned earlier, and when he defined diplomacy. And one of the interesting things, as you mentioned, David, I'm part of Ubuntu, which is Ubuntu Lab Africa, which uses Theory U, and its slogan is "I am because we are." And I think it's going back to that, and it's Theory U is about having an open mind, and an open will, and an open heart for change to happen and to take place. And what I'm trying to say is that at the heart of it, this is what needs to happen. There needs to be a shift in the way we think about things, in embracing change generally, and embracing issues around, complex issues, and when we're looking at how complex it is and how difficult it is how can we deconstruct that and unpack that and look at it from a human to human perspective and experience. And I think that's for me what's trans professional diplomacy is about. It's about living as a diplomat every day, and in mediating and in finding solutions. And some of the example I always remember also what we've wanted to have as a cohabitation between civil government and the army, which unfortunately didn't work out at all. And I think at the heart of it, maybe it was a crisis about preventative diplomacy, and how can we look at using diplomacy to prevent crises, from happening, and in a lot of different ways. And I think the activists had a big role in, and civil society had a big role in, and especially for a government that came after an amazing revolution where just people took to the streets, and their voices made all the difference. I don't know how are we doing for time, David?
I think we've pretty much come to the end of this first segment, if that's all right. But please, wrap things up as you wish.
Yeah, I just want to say maybe the final note is about collaboration, if I haven't said that enough. I think it's how can we make sure that we're collaborating better, and we're making sure that we're having networks, from within and across the different levels. So we're talking about state actors, non-state actors, citizen diplomats, you name it, and I think it's about time that we kind of bring all of them together to address issues such as forced migration. Thank you, David.
Lena, I want to thank you so much for the way that you've begun this panel. And I just loved so many of the questions that you've posed that I hope that we can get to as we move to a discussion. And perhaps your fellow panelists will want to address them as well. But the ones that really stood out for me was how can we unpack the fear of the other? And I think this really brings up the question about the limits of state-sponsored diplomacy and what are the roles that that non-state actor and citizen diplomats can play in doing that. And then I also loved what you asked about, how can non-state actors make the realities of forced migration real for those who are not yet able or willing to engage them? And I think, as you well pointed out, the absolute discrepancies and inequalities between how some refugees are treated and others, it really calls attention to the need for just that question to be addressed. So thank you so much for starting us out. And so at this point in time, I would like now to introduce our second speaker, and that is Mohammed Abu Bakr, who is the president of the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project. Mohammed is a Sudanese human rights activist and peacemaker with a decade and a half of civil society experience. Since high school, Mohammed has founded and led organizations and initiatives focused on humanitarian, human rights, youth empowerment, and peace programs across the Middle East and Africa, including in Darfur, South Sudan, Sudan, Egypt, Israel, the Palestinian territories, and beyond. Mohammed has also documented, reported, and mobilized against human rights abuses across the MEA region, and since arriving in the United States, has become a sought-after voice at the State Department and in Congress concerning policy and human rights issues in the region. I'm also very pleased to note that Mohammed has been a practitioner in residence at the Grace School, and we have benefited so immensely from the ways that he has engaged our students and our university. And Mohammed is also an esteemed member of the Grace School's External Advisory Board. Mohammed joins us today from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Mohammed.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the faculty and administration of the DePaul University's Grace School of Diplomacy for giving Sudan a very rare platform. It's not, Lena has alluded to that earlier, but we're really deprived of platforms to share the Sudanese experience, and I'm not gonna even get into the reasons why, but it's the reality we have to grapple with. Be it in media or in international organizations, Sudan is largely deplatformed and focus on what is legitimately the biggest humanitarian and objectively the biggest humanitarian disaster in the planet is not given 1% of the attention it deserves. And I just wanted to say, Lena, that was a really beautiful and moving and human presentation. That, so much so that I'm gonna make a point of not following you next time because I'm still fighting to keep my lenses in place. And from that poem at the beginning, that was very, very beautiful. And I hope all the students of diplomacy and those who may be interested in diplomacy or pursuing diplomacy degree who are watching right now, um, take note of that. A lot of people think of state-sponsored actors as dry and as kind of robotic. I really hope listening to Lena is shifting that perception for you. You can still be very, very human and be very much an effective state-sponsored diplomat or politician. With that, Elena also covered some of the points. One more reason I should not let you go first next time that I wanted to capture, but she did it so beautifully that I definitely will not repeat them. But I would like to start this presentation with something that I want to anchor my point around. So I'm going to share my screen for you just a second. Um, I think this is the right screen. All right. Is it showing? Okay. So I want you to note something. This map represents the movement of Sudanese since the start of the the April 23 war in Sudan. And I want you to note not much, the biggest movement, which is the internal movement of now about 10 million. These maps are a little bit out of date, despite being the official ones on UNHCR's website. They are still out of date. But I want you to know the external movement, particularly the biggest concentration of those who had to leave Sudan after the war. That would be Egypt and Chad. And I would like to just draw a little bit of comparison between the experience of Sudanese in each of these countries and how actions taken by civil society, by state-sponsored diplomats, and by politicians have affected, and international organizations have affected the outcome and the bottom line for those who actually made it to these countries. In Egypt, um, right off the bat, once the war started, borders were sealed, and a very long-standing treaty between Sudan and Egypt, known as the Four Freedoms Treaty, which allowed citizens of both countries free movement between the two countries. It also allowed them the right to work and to own property freely. Uh, that treaty was suspended immediately upon the start of the war. Sudanese people who usually had like the strongest tie of all, probably in from the surrounded countries to Egypt, trying to go to Egypt, and even those who own properties in Egypt have been stuck at the borders for months at a time, forced to pay north of $3,000 each just to get a security clearance that allows them to enter, not to stay, not to live, just to enter. And while living there, they are completely terrified by the actions taken by the state, including actions such as deportation back to Sudan. All this while state-sponsored media and semi-official channels have been drumming up really disturbing rhetorics around Sudanese individuals and completely steered panic in the streets of Egypt around, some old nationalistic issues that never really been on the forefront for north of a decade, and simultaneously drummed up the effect of arrival of Sudanese. It was a perfect scapegoat in time where when Egyptian economy was tanking at unprecedented speed, to blame the rising prices of goods on the arrival of Sudanese. Mind you, Egypt is a very large country with with an incredible, and it's incredibly dense. It's have north of 100 million citizens, and by comparison, Chad, a much smaller country in terms of GDP, in terms of population, where even the arrival of 100,000 is a significant amount of people to enter. Chad had a very different approach to the arrival of Sudanese. A lot of the statements that came out from government officials, from diplomats, from media were quite positive, and actually promoting opportunity as part of the arrival of Sudanese to Chad. Um, the state of Chad also offered, open border policy to those arriving completely, with documents or no documents. Anybody was welcome to come, and went even further by giving Sudanese who have no documentation some forms of ID, so that they are allowed to move about, but also allowed them to work and start contributing to the economy upon arrival. Now, in Egypt, not only were people not allowed to work and all these rights have been suspended, there have been a rise in xenophobic rhetorics that led to very physically experienced, effects, including rise in hate crimes against people of Sudanese origins, even those who are not really Sudanese, but were just, who looked Sudanese enough, were subject to a lot of racist and hate crime type of treatment from not just the public, but also the state itself. And many actually Nubian Egyptians have been have been incarcerated, and who did not have an ID on them to show how Egyptian they are at the time, ended up in deportation prisons. This has been documented over and over in many states of Egypt, but it happened significantly at a higher rate in Alexandria and Cairo regions. Um, Civil society, I'm going to split that into state, loyalist and non-state loyalist, have been working quite, around the hour in both locations of Chad and Egypt. In Egypt, again, drumming up state, very negative messaging around refugees and around Sudanese refugees in particular. While there has been a lot of work done by civil society that is more in the human rights, leaning to actually integrate and celebrate the arrival of the Sudanese culture, and sponsored a lot of public events and public gatherings that that really promoted Sudanese culture in a very, very positive way. Um, I want to I want to mention that migration has very real detrimental effects on, especially of large numbers all at once, on all of these states, and it's definitely quite burdensome having to find a system to absorb all the new arrivals to a state. I acknowledge that 100%. For example, the arrival of the like Sudanese refugees have significantly higher income than those their peers in Egypt or in Chad, and that did create a lot of inflation in the market, especially in the market of real estate, where those arriving had had to just accept anything told, and it's a very highly irregular, unregulated market, the real estate market. Um, and um, and realtors, whatever they propose to those arriving, they are desperate to find a home, so they will pay anything. And that did create a huge inflation in prices of rent in Cairo, and that definitely something that needs to be acknowledged. It's definitely not their fault that they are being exploited, but it is a reality that the rest of the Egyptian people had to live with. Um, this mirrored also some things that happened in Chad in terms of markets, and the fluctuation of real estate market that happened following the arrival of all these large number of refugees. In Chad's case, again, it's 500,000 to 17 million total population. So it's a significant amount of people arriving to Chad. In Egypt, it's the same number, about 500, around 500,000 in the most, in the biggest estimations. But, while Egypt has north of 100 million population, so it's not really as big an impact and as big a number to absorb, but it still had very real effect on the livelihood of the average Egyptian, making the public sentiment quite understandable, especially when it's backed by state policy of trying to blame tanking economy on refugees. Mind you, probably the arrival of Sudanese at that time was probably the best thing that the state could have asked for, because it brought in incredible amounts of foreign currency into the country, and it really probably helped save the Egyptian economy at a very, very, very critical time. Um, but again, rhetorics matter a lot in how people, actually, the actual displaced people get, the treatment they receive and the experience they live in each of these states. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm just not unsure how to do that. Oh, yeah. I think did it stop? Or am I still sharing?
There, it stopped now.
Okay, great. what uh, what civil society, what citizen diplomats, what state actors all together have to be, the roles they have to assume in all of this, not just for Sudan, but also globally. I mean, migration is a reality of life that is going to keep happening, whether due to conflict or due to climate change or due to any number of reasons why people move. This trend of people moving northward and southward is going to keep on happening, and it has to be dealt with differently. We really need to work work much harder on trying to shift the narrative around migration itself. Need to shift the focus from forced displacement being seen as a crisis, and to viewing it as a form of mobility. You know, I'm not gonna be very positive. Just acknowledge it as a form of mobility, natural form of mobility that needs to have structured legal frameworks. Diplomatic efforts need to be directed towards creating safe and legal pathways for the displaced individuals, and ensuring that their rights are protected under international law. Um, and that is not a role for only state actors. It really is the role for international organizations, as well as for, oh, how am I doing on time, David?
I think it's probably the time to probably wrap things up so we make
Okay,
time
all
for
right,
Hamid. Yes,
all
another
right, all right.
question.
All right. So, yes, citizen diplomats, and as well as state diplomats, as well as civil society, need to be, spend significantly more effort on shifting the narrative around migration itself. That is the point I would like to leave with, but we will get to more points, I'm sure, during the question and answers. Thank you.
Mohammed, thank you so very much for bringing to the attention of our audience so many extraordinary numbers, rather jaw-dropping numbers of people and the number of people who've been displaced. And I certainly hope I want to thank you, all of you, for bringing to the attention of our audience. And I hope that our platform can serve to elevate exactly what needs to be said on this regard. I also really appreciated your final point with regards to the need to create safe and legal pathways for migrant people, and how that really is has to be a collaborative effort across different expressions of diplomacy. So thank you so much for the way that you framed that, and I think you've really brought a lot of things into clear view for us. So at this point in time, it's now my pleasure to introduce Hamid Khalifallah, who is a development practitioner, researcher, and policy analyst. He currently is a PhD student researching political transitions and grassroots movements in Africa at the Global Development Institute of the University of Manchester in the UK. Before that, Hamid worked for a number of international organizations to engage governance and development issues in Sudan. He holds a master's degree in international development from the University of Bradford, where he studied as a Chevening Scholar and was awarded the Development Studies Association Dissertation Prize. Moreover, Hamid is a former fellow of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy in the United States and an alumnus of the Young African Leaders Program at the School of Transnational Governance of the European University Institute in Italy. Hamid's research interests include participatory governance, democracy and democratization processes, citizen-state engagement, and inclusive development. Hamid joins us today from Manchester. Welcome, Hamid. And as Hamid is preparing to speak to us, I just want to call attention to the Q&A portal below, and we welcome questions from the audience that can be submitted there, and I will look forward to sharing them with our panelists. So Hamid, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing the Sudan panel. And thank you so much, Lina and Mohammed, for the great points that you made. It makes it quite difficult to go after you, but I will do my best. And so I just want to start by making, the point of why and how the case of Sudan makes great contributions to our conceptualization of everyday diplomacy and transprofessional diplomatic work. Obviously, there is increasing recognition in the literature and in policy spaces as well of the role of ordinary citizens in diplomacy outside, traditional state-to-state relations. But I think quite often that is seen as complementary to state-to-state diplomacy. And I want to, speak about how in Sudan, this has not been like the role of ordinary citizens in diplomacy has not been complementary to the state's role, but rather, the only role that's being practiced for so many reasons. So yeah, what we see in Sudan is that this diplomatic role and these diplomatic efforts are being predominantly and solely led by Sudanese citizens in Sudan and in the diaspora as well. This happens obviously for so many reasons, vacuums in the role of the state, lack of interest or lack of capacity and competence from the state as well. If we think about the current context, the war that is tearing Sudan down at the moment happened in the context of an unconstitutional military coup, where there's a deficit, obviously, in the official state representation, despite, the military, the Sudanese armed forces currently trying to claim that role, but we leave that for a different conversation. There continues to be this deficit in terms of the role of state in the country. And even before that, we had a regime, an authoritarian regime that lasted for 30 years that was, to a very good extent, isolated from the world and from global diplomatic spaces and so on, for being, sanctioned and being on the list of states sponsoring terrorism and so on. And in this context, Sudanese citizens in Sudan, and like I said, in the diaspora as well, have been tirelessly advocating for Sudan when no one else was doing that. And it's interesting that we're having this discussion today, just a week after the UN, the General Assembly last week in New York, where there have been multiple Sudanese delegations, like civil society delegations, who have been meeting with officials from different states and multilateral institutions. And these delegations, came after so many efforts by Sudanese civil society in terms of raising funds, securing the visas, going there, securing meetings, and so on. And that is definitely a strong example of ordinary citizens diplomacy, particularly in the context of forced migration and forced displacement that we as Sudanese are experiencing as a result of the war. And I think I want to speak more to that, to how Sudanese citizens, diplomats, if you like, have been playing important roles in terms of engaging with other states and other multilateral institutions, and how their experience could inform a lot of our thinking with that. But I think although there's been a lot happening, there are so many challenges. And I think the biggest challenge that I can see is the challenge in terms of the gap between demand and supply, between what is being offered and what is being received. Like I said, like the example of the UNGA delegations is just a very little example of what Sudanese citizens and actors and civil society actors and so on have been doing. There are a lot of efforts being put out there. They're doing all they can to penetrate diplomatic spaces, but there has been so far, particularly after the war and so on, very little room being made for them, and to channel all the efforts that they have been making. And I think that goes hand in hand with what Lean and Mohammed spoke about in terms of how Sudan is being kind of forgotten or ignored rather in media spaces, in diplomatic spaces, in international organizations and so on. But even more so with Sudanese citizens, civil society trying to kind of claim these spaces or trying to enter these spaces. And there's so many examples that demonstrate the untiring work of Sudanese activists and civil society actors, particularly those in forced displacement. There are so many groups now doing a lot of, amazing work in the new centers of Sudanese civil society, if you like, in Kampala, Nairobi, Addis, Cairo, and so on. And these efforts come at a time and in a context where those people leading these diplomatic efforts, everyday diplomacy efforts, are enduring such difficult circumstances in terms of being displaced, facing unfavorable conditions in their new kind of places of residence. Some of it Mohammed spoke about, as in the context in Egypt and Chad and so on, and that is the same. Although many other countries, some of the other countries have been more welcoming and opening spaces and so on, but that is usually you just cross the border and you are allowed in, but then you are left to fend for yourselves. There's no much support going there. And in these very difficult circumstances, they are doing a lot of making a lot of time, doing a lot of efforts to advocate for Sudan, and a truly exemplary example of everyday diplomacy. Being in the UK myself, for instance, and as a new person to join the Sudanese diaspora in the UK and so on, I've been quite impressed by all the work that people do here. But one outstanding example that comes to mind is after the UK elections just a couple of months ago, and the shift in the government from Conservatives to the Labour and so on. There are these parliamentary group that work on specific issues, and with the change of government, they go on holiday basically, and sometimes they never come back. And it was quite amazing to me how the all parliamentary group, which is like a parliamentary group that brings MPs from different political parties and so on. The one working on Sudan was the first to reconvene after the elections because of the efforts of the Sudanese diaspora in the UK, because of how they've been going to the parliament every day, making sure that this does not get lost in the files and so on. Even it reconvened before so many parliamentary groups reconvened about UK national issues. And that was quite amazing to me, the level of effort and dedication that you can see from these people. And, although many of the people in the UK have been living here for years, so they're more well established, they're more integrated into the system and so on, but still a lot of the people leading that effort were, from grassroots groups who have, are not that privileged, to be honest, to give that amount of time and that amount of effort. And there's very little recognition for such efforts. I think one of the other also constraints and difficulties that such groups face, and obviously not in the UK in this context, but more in other places, like if we think about Sudanese cities that have a lot of Sudanese people now, like I mentioned, Kampala, Nairobi, Addis, Cairo, and so on. There's often, and I definitely like the discourse on everyday diplomacy is essentially about decolonizing these diplomatic spaces, right? But there's still often a specific language, outfit, and presentation that comes with this idea of engaging with institutions and states and diplomats. And I think there's a lot that we need to do in that terms and make sure that we are creating more inclusive spaces where truly everyday citizens are able to engage and see themselves as diplomats and engage in these diplomatic spaces. And then also, speaking of the decolonizing diplomatic work and spaces, I think one also thing that and this is not necessarily related to the Sudanese groups that I spoke about, but something that I have seen in my work in Sudan for the past many years before the war and so on, how absolutely, yes, I like I said, it's important that we decolonize these spaces and so on, but I think it's also important that we make sure that while we are trying to push and rethink diplomatic work as something that happens outside the traditional state-to-state spaces and so on, to make sure that we are careful about states co-opting and these spaces or these groups for specific agendas and specific kind of interests. I think one example that comes to mind is about how, I'm not going to name any names, but specific Western governments, if you like, would have like NGOs or charities as part of their soft power to go into countries and create relations with nations. And this is obviously part of this, everyday citizen diplomacy, but it's definitely not the one that you'd advocate. And that goes into basically creating some sort of new colonial relations with specific nations. So I think it's also important as we look at the amazing things that everyday diplomacy and everyday citizen kind of engagement in these diplomatic spaces does from a positive side. It's also important to think about, the other negative things to it. And I think I would just, these are the main points that I wanted to make. And I think I would just end with trying to answer one of the questions posed by the panel, but not necessarily having an answer for it, which is in terms of, which institutions are best to kind of protect this trans-professional diplomatic work and so on. And I think one important thing that we are seeing now as Sudanese and as people in the global south in general, if you like, is that this is definitely not like the institutions that are going to protect this work are definitely not the multilateral institutions that we are seeing today, not the UN, definitely, and similar organizations, because what we have seen and what we have now learned, hopefully, is that these institutions have been created and continue to operate to protect specific systems, specific people, and specific, parts of the world, and that does not necessarily include us. So I think when we think about these new forms of diplomacy, I think also rethinking the entire system where diplomatic work and efforts go through and into and so on is quite essential. I will end here and look forward to a discussion.
Hamid, thank you so very much for that really compelling presentation. I must say, there of the many things that you mentioned, one thing that caught my attention was the wonderful example you gave of the Sudanese diaspora in the UK having an impact on the choices made in Parliament. And I think that the whole notion of diasporic diplomacy is a very powerful one, and one that needs to be explored more. And clearly, there is an immense Sudanese diaspora engaged in so many different places in the world. So thank you so very much for that presentation. What a marvelous panel. We have some questions from the audience that I would like to share with you now. And the first one comes from Julie Fergus. She says, hello, my name is Julie Fergus, and I'm currently pursuing my master's degree in refugee and forced migration studies at DePaul. What systemic and institutional changes need to take place to achieve the shift in narrative that both Lena and Mohammed were speaking about? Is this change something that can come about simply through moving away from Western capitalist ideals? Or is there something deeper? Thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge, Lena, Mohammed, and Hamid. So I'm thinking, why don't we go back? Why don't we go back to Lena, our first speaker, and then Mohammed, and then Hamid? And we would love to hear your responses to Julia's question.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks, Mohammed and Hamid, as well. A lot of, thanks, Julia. It's not an easy question, but I think you nailed it. I think we're seeing a shift in. The whole system. The whole system. I think we're kind of looking at a crisis in a way. Where whatever you look at, there's a major issue. There's a major challenge. It's very complex. If we're looking at ecological, social, political, across all different kinds of divides. And I think maybe what I tried to say earlier is that we need higher consciousness, or conscientiousness, or I think the awareness level of needs to shift, and maybe that's my point around looking at how we can do things differently in a way. So it's not just about Western capital, ideals, or moving to a different way, or a more Zen-like, to be honest, approach. I think it's important that we kind of deconstruct. Diplomacy, or even if we're looking at refugee and forced migration, you've got, international humanitarian law, you've got refugee law that is basically, sitting there, and you've got, new ways where states are pushing back and making sure that this is not valid anymore. So, everything's becoming obsolete in a way. So I think the institutional change that we're talking about is about rethinking in a new way, maybe it's about time. I think even when we look at the League of Nations, and then the United Nations, and maybe it's about time that we look at a new system. I don't know. It's I'm sorry I don't have an answer, but I think it's about time that maybe we need to collaborate more and bring everyone on board. And I think it's about these voices and dialogue, and creating spaces for conversation, for thinking differently and innovatively. Thank you.
Lena, thank you so much for that. And I think it's safe to say that all of us have more questions than answers, but this is part of the conversation, and this is part of our collaboration, because we must first ask these questions and ask them together. So thank you so much. Mohammed, would you like to respond to Julia's question?
Yeah, thank you, Julia, for the question. In my presentation, what I meant by shifting the narratives is to try to start establishing a new way we look at forced displacement. What I mean by that in more details is to view it as just a natural way of movement, just like tourism. You know, tourism comes with its, with its burdensome side and with its perky side, right? I wanna us to acknowledge that migration is a natural form of movement. Displacement is a natural form of movement that not only is happening right now, that it's going to only keep on happening more and more. The more the planet heats up, the more, the more political instability, that we see right now in the Middle East and elsewhere, rage, the more we're going to see of that. And we ought to start treating it like, oh, the sky is falling. No, this is something that we know that is going to come, that is going to happen. And we ought to try to, as a system, look at it differently, not as a crisis that is incoming, but no, a natural form of movement that will come with some perks and with some downfalls. And we shape our systems to try to treat these humans as such, and I wanna like I again efforts like the ones done in Chad, going back to Sudan, in Chad by brokered by UNHCR, but other UN agencies, to get the documentation part, the probably the biggest reason for applause for the state of Chad is the fact that they tried to give Sudanese not only legal status, but new documentation issued by the state so they can integrate immediately economically and start contributing. There is no language barrier, there is no cultural barrier. They are ready for integration immediately. And opening that door wide open really changed how the displaced Sudanese in Chad experiences displacement. Um, I want to say this is like a global thing though. Like migration, even forced migration, still comes with a lot of perks to the host nation. It contributes to enhancement. Like I remember the nativist sentiment when Germany started receiving, all these Syrian refugees. But the fact is, simply put, Germany was getting a lot of young people who are highly educated to come and start working as soon as they just get through the threshold of language barrier. And again, figures show over and over that Germany only benefited from all this absorption of these refugees, and definitely made more than it lost in the process of their integration. If we keep, it's not gonna be in our control to change how an average person may feel about arrival of refugees. That's not, everybody's entitled to their feelings. But if states start to try to promote migration as what it is, including forced displacement, as the opportunity that it is, as the opportunity that needs management that it is, I think the whole experience could shift significantly for the millions and millions who will be in the same shoes of people in Sudan for different reasons.
A very compelling observation, because you're talking about the fact that migration is something that happens, and it will continue to happen. The idea of shifting people's perception, I think, is certainly a very important work of the diplomat, and particularly those people on the ground representing the groups that all of you have been engaged in. So thank you for that, Mohammed. Hamid, would you like to address this question?
Sure. I think, yeah, it is an interesting question, an important one, but also a difficult one. And I think one important thing is that, similar to the discourse on transprofessional diplomacy, I think also the discourse on institutions and systems, and that are governing and governing the world and so on. I think we need to start like really meaningfully going beyond traditional actors, as far as these political and multilateral institutions and systems are concerned. And I think there have been so many efforts to reform the system, but I don't think that is going to work. As Nina mentioned, we need to deconstruct the system, and I think we need, there it must be like an a paradigm shift in terms of how these systems work, so that it starts from the below, like it's a bottom up process, and these systems the hierarchy need to change, so that it can become bottom up, and starts from the below, so that it can really serve us, the people, and so on. Because these multilateral institutions, these multilateral systems, and so on, have failed us. States in so many parts of the world have definitely failed us, and I'm not talking only about, autocratic states and regime and so on. Even the so-called democratic states in the West have been failing the people. And in terms of, like, for instance, in terms of diplomacy, the fixation on sovereignty and national interests, in terms of, foreign policy and diplomacy in most of the countries and so on, whose sovereignty and whose national interests are we speaking about? Is it the states or is it the people? So I think that kind of like really pushes us to start trying to deconstruct everything and make sure that these institutions and systems are bottom up rather than top down, where there's serving specific regimes and systems, rather than the people, whether within countries or globally as humans.
I mean, thank you so very much for that. I must say that in listening to all three of you, I think you've made a really compelling case for the absolute centrality of citizen diplomacy in addressing these issues, because it's clear that there are so many gaps in this circumstance that cannot be addressed at the state-sponsored level. And so I just want to thank all three of you for three wonderful windows into an absolutely compelling and vital and critical part of our world that we all share. So Lena Magoo, Mohammed Abu Bakr, Hamid Khalifallah, thank you so very, very much. We're now going to take a break, and we are going to return at 20 minutes past the hour for our keynote address of the day, which is going to be given by Shalja Sharma of DePaul University. So please enjoy a break, and we will look forward to seeing you at 20 minutes past the hour. Thank you so much to all three of you. And I look forward to us continuing our conversation off camera.
Thank you, David.